Hi there, I'm Mark and I'm going to talk to you today about the basics of calling the APIs within the GSE. The GSE supports a number of different APIs for both receiving and sending of data, particularly signals, to the platform. We've adopted a very simple, standard, RESTful type API approach to accessing data from the GSE, and this starts with the definition of what we call API keys. So on the left-hand side in the platform, you'll see the API keys menu item. For within there, we can manage one or more API keys. For convenience, when your account was set up, you will already have an API key that's active, and you'll notice that that API key is accessible for both receiving and sending of data. But it's possible to set up API keys for other people to use, which are either just for sending or just for receiving purposes. And there's that flexibility built into the platform. So if you wish to have some users of your system who just send data, they can have a sending key. And some people that want to just receive data can have simply a receiving key, and you have that flexibility. Having defined an API key, we then come to how you will call the APIs. And on the platform, we have comprehensive documentation for how to receive signals and send signals, which you can see on the left-hand side under the API section. So moving to receiving signals, these are typically modeled, as you might expect, as sort of GET-based REST requests. And you can see on the right-hand side, we see on the panel at the top the mechanism by which you can call these APIs. There are two basic approaches for calling APIs for receiving signals. One is the one we recommend for testing only, which is what's called the HTTPS method, where you can very simply construct a URL containing the endpoints starting with signals.gse.live/feed, and then the API you wish to call, in this case the 24-hour API, but it could be any of the other APIs for receiving. And you can then simply supply the API key and the secret as request parameters to the URL. And then following that, any other parameters that would be applicable to that particular API, in this case as an ID from element. So for testing purposes, it's very quick to simply append parameters to a URL for testing. We do, however, recommend using, for production use, using the curl method for accessing our APIs for receiving signals. And in that case, the general pattern would be to, instead of using passing the key and secret within the URL, you'd instead supply them as headers to the request. You can see here it gives you the documentation for using the API key header with your key and the API secret header with your secret to make that a little bit more secure for sending for production use. In terms of sending signals to us, it's a very similar kind of pattern, and most of the requests are modelled as simple POST requests, which typically involve sending a payload for the data involved for sending. And that's usually signal data in some sort of format, standard format here, and usually supplied most often as an array of data, so you can supply more than one entry at a time. Once again, in this case, there is no sort of shortcut HTTPS because we're looking at POST requests, so you would use curl, and in that case, we would recommend always using the header syntax here to supply the keys and the secrets. So that's the basics of calling our APIs. Thank you for watching today.